Thank you very much, everybody. I just want to make sure you can hear me at the back. Can you hear me? You can, great. And just to also reassure you, I want to see where Joseph is, because he's going to tell me when it's time to wrap up. Where is Joseph? Oh, he's not there for the moment, so he should appear. So I have time. I can keep talking for 3 hours until Joseph reappears. So about a year ago, just under a year ago, I was in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And I was there as part of a group from the Association of Science and Technology Centres, because Sri Lanka wanted to set up a national science centre. They've recently finished a civil war. They want to reap the benefits of not spending so much money on fighting. And part of that structuring the new Sri Lanka is to create a new science centre. So there I am, ready to talk to them. And this isn't the first time I've done this. I've been very, very lucky. I've worked in science centres for quite some time now, almost entirely on getting new projects up and running, and children's museums too. And so I've actually been to places as far apart as Qatar, Thailand, Australia, Finland, Las Vegas, a lot of places around the world that have all got this commitment that science and technology education can really change the future, and how can they do it, and what is the part that a science centre can play in this. So I always start by showing a picture of the world. We're sharing the world, and Miami is in this world, and it's in a very unique, location. It's sticking right out there in the middle of the ocean, a long way from anywhere. So the first time I think actually the second time I went on one of these events, it was a 3-day seminar in Brazil. So here I am in Rio. It's a while ago, so I've not been working in this field for so long, and it's the first time I've been invited to actually really speak in public before a whole range of different people. And it's a 3-day seminar, and there's a whole load of really impressive people, so I think I am really wonderful now, right? I've got there. This is me, I'm wonderful. And that all of us, all of the people from Europe and America, we do through 2 days, we keep talking about how wonderful we are and how wonderful these projects are. And the people from Brazil don't get a word in edgeways. And then on the 3rd day, it's their turn, and they talk about what they're doing. Well, the thing is, they're doing things with the tribes in the Amazonian jungle. They're doing things with the street kids in Sao Paulo. They have really massive programs in Rio trying to see how health education can really make a difference in the people that are not so advantaged in Brazil. And I feel, I can only say, humbled and somewhat ashamed that I felt I knew it all and could tell everybody what they should be doing. So from that time onwards, I've always felt that whenever I did one of these journeys to another country, the one thing I would try and achieve was to make the people realize that I don't know and they don't know for the moment, but we could find out what we ought to be doing, and we should really try and explore that and see what the opportunities might be. So here I am now in Colombo. And if you look at it, pretty much the same as Miami, right? Stuck out there in the middle of nowhere with all of ocean around it, looking out to the world rather than inwards. And the people in Sri Lanka have a big point of saying that they are not Indian. They may be pretty much near the Indian continent, and they're near it, but they're not the same as India. Guess what they want to do? They want to see Colombo as the next Singapore. So like we envy Silicon Valley, they want to be the next Singapore. They're really interested in startups and new technology. They want science education to unite the country. They also want to make sure that they stop talent leaving, because they have a good education system, but the people that are graduates, they all go off to UK to do a master's degree or the US, and many don't come back home. So how can they keep people at home? So anything about this seem familiar? Yeah. So that's the point I want to make. It's a global competition for talent. There are places all over the world that are competing for talent, and Miami is just one among a lot of global places. And if we're going to be this international global city of the future, we have a lot of competitors, we have a lot of advantages, and we better kind of set about it in a solid way. So the US, contrary to what you hear, is not actually doing so well in this global competition as you might think. Okay, the economy is improving. I think we're all pretty pleased about that. If you go back to 2002, the US was putting out about half the global patents, right? The University of California had more patents coming out every year than India and China combined. If you go to 2012, the top country putting out patents is China, the second is the US, the third is Japan. If you look at the numbers of patents actually accepted, it goes Japan, US, China. And there's a wide range of other countries that are edging up to the top 10, not always the biggest. So countries such as Finland, for example, do really well in terms of the number of patents that come out from there. So we're not doing as well as we might do, and we have to ask ourselves why. One of the reasons could well be science education. So if you look at the scores, there's a thing called PISA, which does the scores around the world each year, and if you look at the scores there, I think it's something like in Shanghai, 55% of the kids at 15 are in the top echelon. In the US, it is 9%. There are 27 other countries better than us in math at 15, and math is a really fundamental thing for it. So we can't rest on our laurels. What we do have is a strong commitment to encouraging people to do stuff. The entrepreneurship is great. That's particularly true of Miami. And then we can look at things like the work of Richard Florida and see what are those factors that make a city great for the future. So I expect most of you are familiar with Richard Florida's work. Some nods out there. So he's a guy that looked at what keeps the creative class in a place and why do they go, what are the reasons for people leaving. So it can be summed up in a few words beginning with T, and I'll try and remember them all without looking at my notes, but I might not. So it's talent, it's technical infrastructure, it's what they call territorial assets, and, I've listed another one out, I always do this, tolerance is another one, right? So there's a real important tolerance, and diversity helps a place be culturally creative and attracts talent. Territorial assets both means environment and climate. Well, Miami and Colombo are pretty much the same on that one. You've got the ocean, you've got the jungle nearby in Colombo, we've got the Everglades just next to us. Territorial assets also mean things like cultural hubs and good schools, because people move where there are cultural hubs and good schools. And then the third one, technology, high level of infrastructure, and talent is what we want to attract here. So the one factor that Miami really does not do well on is technical skills. It has a great track record of things starting up here and then they go off someplace else. So part of our challenge is going to be how are we going to keep them here. There are two other studies that are out there that are interesting. The Knight Foundation study on the soul of the community, which shows how we don't score very highly on volunteering or on a sense of community. And I think those are really important things that we need to try and encourage. We have a big volunteer program for restoring the environment, and we think it's important as a way of getting people to grow roots. And then we really want to look at just both what are these things that we can do in terms of the general social environment for learning, and then what are the models of learning, and what is the cultural impact that you might get one way or another. There are a myriad of learning models out there, and I am not going to take you on the history of learning today. That would be too boring, but there's just a range of them. So I'm just going to talk about two that I personally find interesting. They're actually quite challenging as how you translate that into a museum experience. So one is a guy called Vygotsky, who's dead, and he talked about a zone of proximal learning. So the idea is, if you really want to learn something, you need a sort of gap between one person that's putting some information out and the other person that at that stage is receiving it and transmitting it back. That exchange of meanings helps you to build up your picture in your mind. If the gap's too great, so if I just talk a whole load of jargon and blah-de-blah and I go on and on, you won't be learning anything. If I say stuff that you all know absolutely everything about, you don't learn anything either, though we might enjoy the conversation because we could both think we were good. But the best learning happens when you have this sort of gap and you try and see how you bridge the gap. Now, the challenge for something like a museum is, how do you set that up? Because you've got this whole wide range of diverse audience coming through, and you're trying to see how you could make that gap something that they could have a challenge, get across, and learn something from. That's one thing I'll come back to. Another one is a guy whose name I can't even say, and actually this means I can now change my picture. So we're trying to look at how we can make sparks fly between different people, get their brains going, to appreciate what's happening really, really up close. And finally, flow. So this guy's called a name I can never pronounce. It's Kent-Smolewski. I can never say it, something like that. I can spell it out for you later. And he focused on flow. I found this really interesting. I came upon it by chance. So he studied a load of people that are real experts in things that got an intense pleasure out of their work. So it could be people like playing a violin, or somebody that is a sculptor, or mountaineering, for example, things that talk about intense pleasure in the job. And really, when you're into that and you're really, really doing it, you get this sense of concentration and stepping outside time and really having what's known as a flow experience. So this is quite interesting, because when you watch people inside exhibits, something I've always noticed, if you offer something to a child, for example, first of all, their hands go out. So hands are something that you really want to get onto learning for. But when a kid gets really engrossed in an exhibit, or an adult for that matter, they don't actually look like they're having fun or looks very smiley. They look really, really serious and intent on what they're doing. And that's the moment when you know that they're really entering into the experience, their minds are really engaged and they're really thinking. So that's the kind of intent that we want to have within our exhibit experiences. The challenge is how to do it. So it's more, I like to use the words enjoy in the sense of disfructar or en profiter. It's that whole sense of wrapping your arms around it and really having a great pleasure out of it. And also delight, because I think there's no greater delight than something discovered and a love of learning. But in order to learn something, you have to know that you didn't know it in the first place and really be willing to explore it. So before I started working in science centres, I actually was living in France, and I taught for a while in an international school. So I was either teaching French kids whose parents wanted them to learn really good English, so they did not understand the silently very well, but I taught them in French, or in English, as the case may be. And then I also taught groups that were kids that had come from anywhere, so it's middle and high school kids, and whose English or French might have been mediocre, or could be good, but they've come from somewhere else. And I just want to tell you 3 stories which really struck me at the time and helped me to start thinking about cultural differences. So that's the first time I came across the history of technology, actually. So in England, we think that James Watt invented the steam engine. In France, it's Denis Papin. So I kind of thought they were facts, you know, but they're not. They're culturally sensitive. And it depends which book you read as to where it was. Also, actually, my kids came home with a school book about the First World War. You'll be pleased to know that the French were valiant fighters, and then the Americans came in at the end and helped them. And actually, the English didn't feature at all in the First World War. So one day, I've got this group of middle school kids, and we're making electric motors, right? And it's a load of, recycled materials, and we're winding motors and everything. In a class of 30-something, there's always one that doesn't work, right? So this French kid says to me, well, it doesn't work. I wouldn't expect it to work. It's just a set of garbage. And I sort of look at him like he's being rude. And then I think, it's actually quite interesting what he said, because in France, you know, if you buy a cake, they wrap it up for you and give it to you. If you buy a steak, they spend a lot of time taking out all the little bits of fat and everything, and then they wrap it up and they give it to you like it's a really wonderful present, this steak that you've bought. Wrapping things up and doing it properly is really, really a fundamental part of the French culture. So me giving this kid a load of stuff to tinker with was a great dissonance with his head. If he'd had a proper set-out kit with all the bits laid in properly, he could have done it, right? But to encourage him to tinker, it really wasn't part of his culture at all. I had 2 other really weird experiences. I had one kid that had come from the Middle East and had only ever been taught by a tutor before, so he'd never been in a class before. He was supposed to be a grandmaster at chess, so he's obviously a bright kid, but he sat in the class and he learnt nothing. And I couldn't get my head around this. So I started talking before the class, saying this is what we're going to be talking about. And I discovered 2 minutes at the beginning and 3 minutes at the end, and he could do the class. But if you just sat him there, he didn't understand the cultural context of learning in a class. And the same thing happens with people coming into museums who haven't learnt the museum culture. And then my third one is a group of Iranian girls at 15. We're doing moments. You know, it's a thing I've done with quite smaller kids in the UK. So you get some sort of balance thing, and you put some weights on here, and you put some heavier weights nearer the fulcrum in the middle, and the thing balances. I watched these 3 Iranian girls trying to do this. They're 15, right? They're bright, they're smart. They could not do it. They'd never been on any kind of, you don't call it a seesaw, you know, the kids' toy that goes up and down like that you balance on? Balançoire in French, I think there's another word for it in America. They've never had any kind of hands-on physics experiment before. They absolutely can't do this until you tell them what to do, and then they suddenly get the point. The only reason I'm telling you these stories is we make assumptions when we do any kind of teaching or learning or offering a cultural experience that people will know what to do and understand, and generally they don't, and generally we don't know what the challenge is that they're facing to come to it. So I think the big point I wanted to make out is that there is a real big cultural context to learning. There are people that know a lot about this, and if you're interested, there's a load of research out there. 2 people worth looking up is Sally Dwensing, who's acted as a consultant here. She did her PhD comparing kids in science centers in California with kids in science centers in Trinidad. So very different educational system. The typical model in a US science center is that you get these school groups in, they'll go crazy, they run around for ages, shouting and screaming, and then if you're lucky, you get them together for half an hour to do some kind of focused activity where you really make sure that the experiences they've gained have got to that next level of education. If you try that in Trinidad, and I've worked in Trinidad, they don't have that culture in their schools at all. It's schools very disciplined, very formal. They come to the science centre, they are basically uncomfortable at the thought that they would be let out, and their teachers don't wish to let them out in any kind of way to run around. They ask for that structured activity at the beginning in order to introduce them to the whole way of learning before they have the courage to go off and explore separately. I had another friend that worked on a literacy project in the East End of London, and she found that parents who had no museum experience, and new arrival in the UK with different languages, they would be comfortable if they had a workshop activity at the beginning, you know, around some activity that they were used to before they got on to any other kind of hands-on cultural activity that they would do. The other person doing a lot of work in this area is a woman called Barbara Rogoff. She has done work looking at how you compare different sorts of learning styles in different groups between, in California, the Anglo parents, the Hispanic parents, and also looking at some Indian parents, and looking at different models about things like learning alongside, learning together, as well as how you integrate the interactive experiences. So I think those are all things that when we're trying to develop a new museum, we need and try to take into consideration as how do we really develop something which is unique and which will serve a very broad range of the population. And we particularly have a commitment to it being all the population. This is the museum for the people. So this includes people who have not been in before. And a typical parent with a child who's not been in the museum before, even if the child is comfortable because they've been here before, is to grab the child by the hand and kind of hold on to them and not let them go in case something nasty happens to this child, right? So you have to realize what a challenge it is for many people to come here. So there's 2 or 3 things I want to say about the new museum, and then I will kind of get to the end of it and what we want you to do. So there's a whole load of trends out there in society, and they obviously impact a science museum, and we need to look at what they are. But there's a lot of things which are really going for us, if you like. People are wanting authentic, real experiences. They're wanting memorable experiences. They're wanting personalized experiences. They want something that's immediate. Actually, this is a bit of a challenge. So people want, like a video or anything like that, they want something that hasn't been on the news yet, right? So they really want the very, very latest thing. So part of our program going forward, something Biff's very active in, is developing science communication programs so we can have the scientists talking about their research before it's even got to the stage of being announced. So something you couldn't possibly get anywhere else, for example. And then gamification is another kind of growing trend, and the education programs here have really been exploring the use of virtual media as a way of engaging young people. And one of the things I found very amusing and interesting, well, two actually. So one is, if we get a real scientist in here and talking to our youth groups, we have this group called Upward Bound that's 9th through 12th grade, they often like difficult to ask questions of this scientist. Or the time when their faces all fell was, I was with a young woman scientist and they said, and what car do you drive? And she had an old Subaru. And that she'd just been saying how she spent 7 years to get to the end of her PhD. And their faces all fell, like 7 years and you end up with an old Subaru? So that doesn't work, right? If we get somebody videoed in, right, so they're not actually here, they're videoed in, they do ask more questions. The best one is if the scientist or the astronaut appears as an avatar and all the kids have their own avatars and they spend hours looking absolutely fabulous as avatars, and then the whole thing goes much better. And I think actually it's a real magical way of learning. So a summer ago we had a group that was working on coral reefs, and I went to see how they were doing the first day, and they started by learning how to draw an avatar and developing a tool. And I was rather late, so there was just this one rather large, lumpy lad still there. And he had this totally svelte avatar with a laser eye and a headband on and everything. He looked fabulous. And then I said, and what was the tool you developed? And he showed me very proudly on his screen this tool he developed. And it was sort of like a mega baseball bat for bashing things up. Well, the program was about coral reefs. So I went into what I have for adolescents, what I call my mode, right? Oh, interesting. You know, so you don't actually say great. You don't say, oh, that's terrible. You go, oh, and hope something better comes out later, right? So I went back at the end of the week, and this same child was there, and he took me on a transect across a coral reef of all the different things that he had done during the week, so he knew by the end of the week all the corals. So I just think that this is a whole meeting that is very interesting. So I'm now going to wrap up super rapidly, just to tell you that in our new museum, we have, because I've got some more pictures, we do have a innovation centre. These are just to keep you amused. You know there's some data that if you have PowerPoints, you listen less and learn less than if somebody just talks or if you read, either of those. So this white building is our innovation centre, right? And in February, Biff will be giving a Creative Morning talk, and then we'll be having a sort of 3 or 4 day session trying to get feedback from the community about what should be in the Innovation Centre that can make a real difference for the community, and how should we be targeting this and how should we be doing it. So we will want you to be there. We know we can be a fabulous showcase. We'll have over 750,000 people coming each year. We know we can have great technology, wonderful showcase, gathering people together, catalyzing actions. We really want to make sure this is our tank that we've just poured. It's not been done anywhere else like this. It took 24 hours to pour it. And there it is under being poured. And one to begin. And I'm going to end with a quote. So I thought this was from Feynman actually, but I've discovered it's from Asimov. That's why I couldn't find it when I kept doing Feynman quote. It didn't come up. So he said, the most exciting phrase to hear in science is not eureka, but, ooh, that's funny. So what I want you all to find is some more funny moments when you think, wow, I wonder what that's all about, and see how we can come up with some great solutions together. Thank you.